Hi, and welcome to an explanation of analytical method number 2, putting evidence into historical context. Today we're going to take a look at a segment of a text by a socialist named Morris Hillquit. Hillquit was writing in 1917 in order to persuade the U.S. to stay out of World War One. Now he was writing. Obviously not to the broadest audience. The broadest audience isn't going to be reading articles by socialists against U.S. government policy. But he was writing to a narrower, more a narrow audience already inclined to be socialist and pacifist and to agree with him. Now, when we're putting the evidence into historical context, not only do we want to think about, say, whom he's talking to, we also want to think about like what is going on in the author's world. We want to figure out what kind of current events are weighing heavily in the author's mind, and figure out the connections between the author's world and the text. So in this excerpt, Hillquit writes, "Every great national or international iniquity has ever been clothed by its apologists in the iridescent garb of lofty idealism, and so this war is presented to us as a fight for democracy and justice." Now, during this time period, Hillquit is living in the U.S. This is during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, whose foreign policy was famously described as moral diplomacy, which meant that Wilson, in theory, was against, say, the use of force for power politics' sake, for getting, for strategic advantage for the country or economic advantage, things like that. But very often those sentiments didn't match up to what was really going on in the world in terms of U.S. policy. Just before this, for instance, the U.S. had committed or done a small-scale invasion of Mexico in order to track down and capture Pancho Villa, who had previously raided a small town in New Mexico. And this was seen by Hillquit and other socialists as a blatant violation of any kind of sense of morality in terms of U.S. policy, and American foreign policy towards Mexico during this time period, in a broader sense, had undermined other democratic governments, and for the profit of oil companies, for the profit of other American investors in Mexico who were trying not to get their investments, say, nationalized by the government, and so on. So it's these things that are weighing heavily in Hillquit's mind when he talks about this kind of the glaze of justice and democracy over foreign policy, over foreign policies that are at heart rapacious and economically motivated. Wilson's foreign policies towards other Latin American countries had similar results. There'd been a series of small-scale invasions and occupations of Latin American countries over the last decade and a half, even before Wilson's presidency, but always with the idea of, say, keeping the sovereignty of the Latin American countries safe from either their own warlords or from European intervention. So this is very, very, very high on Hillquit's mind. Hillquit goes on to say, "No doubt, many of our ardent war apostles are entirely sincere in their professions. No doubt the bulk of the emotional masses unquestioningly accept this idealistic theory." And this not only kind of speaks to the increasing success that government propaganda is having in terms of persuading the population that certain policies are happening for idealistic reasons and not for economic ones, but it speaks to the idea that this is the age of the penny press, of very widespread literacy. There's urbanization, and all these new migrants to the cities are getting are for the first time really engaging in the debates about the direction of U.S. foreign policy. And so this is very much informing Hillquit's kind of his point about, okay, these people are perhaps not very not very on top of things. They are not able to see through what the government is telling them. They're sincere, but that doesn't make them right. And again, this is looking at things somewhat through Hillquit's eyes. You may very well come to an analytical point that would make you think that Hillquit was not correct, based on the arguments he's making. So these are all things that are very important that are going on in the world that are looming large to Hillquit. He goes on to say, but this cannot blind us to the fact that the war is essentially commercial in its origin, and that it is largely waged for material gain, at least insofar as the governments of some of the leading belligerent countries are concerned. And this, like thinking more about the author's preoccupations and what's going on in his world, by this point, socialist theory, Marxist theory, has it's some Marxists are surprised that at this point that the leading capitalist countries of the world, Germany, say, England, to some extent the U.S., have not had revolutions, have not had socialist revolutions yet, and so they've been looking at unexpected developments like the massive increase in imperialism during this time period, and theorizing that it's the expansion of imperialism that allows the capitalist governments of Germany, France, Britain, the U.S. To stay in power and not be overthrown, because all of a sudden the tensions that would have overwhelmed the capitalist system in those advanced countries have been lessened somewhat by the ability to extract resources from Africa and Asia through imperialism. So this kind of economically oriented expansion is one of the most important world trends during this time period, and it's something that Hillquit and other socialists really have their eyes on. Okay, so we've looked at these three sentences and kind of pointed towards what's going on in the real world during the time Hillquit's writing this, and how that might have kind of shaped his thoughts and his ideas. But that's not the end point. That is about what we're going to finish this explanation with. But once you brainstorm and connect the dots between the text and between the real world, that in some ways is where your real analysis begins, because you've got lots more. I guess you've got lots more kind of raw product to work with and to analyze and to figure out the connections, what makes sense, where Hillquit might be going wrong, and why he might be doing that, and so on and so on. There are lots of different things you can do, but putting it in its historical context is kind of a first step in working up the raw textual material to work with. Well, that's a lot to think about. So good luck, and obviously you do need to know things about the time period in question, but that's why you take history in the first place. So happy hunting, good analysis, and talk to you later.